Opening movement, why this question hooked me. The official Yang-Mills mass gap problem asks for a rigorous construction of quantum Yang-Mills theory in four-dimensional space and a proof that it has a positive mass gap. The Klay Mathematics Institute says experiments and computer simulations suggest this gap exists, but no proof is known. It also says solving the problem will require fundamental new ideas. That phrase mattered to me. Fundamental new ideas. Because I was not approaching the question as a trained mathematician trying to fill in the next technical step. I was approaching it as someone who had already been building a framework around wholeness, binary, unresolved potential, resolved form, coherence, collapse, manifestation, and the field as a runtime map. So when I saw the Yang-Mills mass gap, I did not only see a physics problem. I saw a question sitting directly on the fault line of my entire framework. Officially, the problem asks, why is there a positive gap between the vacuum and the first real excitation? But through my framework, it sounded like something deeper. What is the minimum interval required for unresolved potential to become coherent expression? That is why it hooked me. Because if reality operates through a binary of unresolved potential and resolved potential, 0 and 1, then the question of the gap is not incidental. It goes straight to the mechanism by which anything becomes anything. What makes potential become form? What separates unresolved possibility from coherent actuality? Why is there a threshold at all? Why can't reality blur continuously from nothing into something? Why does there have to be a real transition, a real landing, a real first state? That is why the problem felt alive. It seemed to be asking the same question I had been asking everywhere else. What makes the real become real? Not vaguely. A field cannot just become anything. A state cannot appear until it coheres. An unresolved configuration is not almost a resolved configuration. An almost state is not a state. A desire contradicted by premise is not almost manifestation. A field configuration that has not cohered is not a lower energy particle. Something either resolves into a coherent state or it remains unresolved potential. That was the hidden hinge. The mass gap sounded like reality saying, there is no half state, there is no almost real, there is no vague smear that gets to count as expression before coherence has occurred. And if that could be understood, maybe the same structure would explain everything else. Why manifestation fails when the frame is contradictory. Why energy gets blocked when the system has not cohered. Why flow begins only when resistance drops. Why a shot goes in when the shooter stops forcing. Why words fail when they try to replace contact. Why love matters because it allows form without possession. But at the beginning, I did not know all that yet. At the beginning, I only knew the question felt important. It felt like if I could understand it, I would not just understand a math problem. I would understand the gap between the invisible and the visible, between potential and expression, between 0 and 1, between becoming and form. From the conventional side, the reason Yang-Mills has not been solved is clear. The problem demands more than physical intuition. It requires a rigorous mathematical construction of the theory and proof of the positive mass gap. That is the official difficulty. But from my angle, there was another difficulty underneath it. Maybe the gap is hard to prove because it is not just another object inside the system. Maybe the gap is the condition by which objects become objects. If you look only at the numbers, you miss the movement. If you look only at the resolved states, you miss the becoming between them. And if you try to prove the between by turning it into another resolved object, you may already have collapsed the thing you were trying to understand. That is where the metaphysical significance began. At first, I thought the gap was the threshold between latent capacity and coherent movement. The passage from 0 to 1, the first transition, the first state. But that was still too crude. Because the more I looked at number, the more obvious it became that the gap was not only between 0 and 1. The same gap appears between every number. The same movement carries every transition. 0 to 1, 1 to 2, 2 to 3, and onward. The number is only the mark. The gap is the becoming between marks. That is where the inquiry actually began. Act 1, the space between the numbers. At first I thought the gap was the threshold between 0 and 1. 0 is unresolved potential, 1 is resolved potential. 0 as what has not appeared, 1 as the first distinguishable mark. So the question seemed simple, even if the answer was not. How does nothing become something? How does potential become expression? How does the unassigned become assigned? How does the field cross the first threshold into a real state? That seemed like the whole mystery. The passage from 0 to 1, the first transition, the first landing. But the longer I stayed with it, the more that framing started to feel incomplete. Because once one appears, the same question appears again. What carries 1 to 2? What carries 2 to 3? What carries 3 to 4? What moves the sequence forward? If I only ask how 0 becomes 1, I make the first transition special in a way that hides the larger structure. The same mystery repeats. Every number lands, then another number lands, then another. But the number is only where the movement has already arrived. The number is the mark. The real question is what carries one mark into the next. That was the first turn. The gap was not only between 0 and 1. The gap was between every number. And once I saw that, I had to stop treating the number as the main event. A number is a completed distinction. It tells me something has landed. It tells me potential has resolved into a position. But the number does not explain the movement that made it appear. The sequence is not really one thing, then another thing, then another thing. It is movement, mark, movement, mark, movement, mark. The mark is visible, the movement is harder to see. And because the mark is visible, the mind naturally gives authority to the mark. It wants the number, it wants the result, it wants the thing it can point to. But the question that had pulled me in was not finally about the mark. It was about the movement that lets a mark appear at all. The gap itself is not a counted thing. It is the process by which countability emerges. That changed the whole question. Because if the gap is the process by which countability emerges, then I cannot understand it by immediately trying to turn it into one more counted thing. That would already be downstream of it. That would be taking the movement and freezing it into the kind of object the movement produces. This is where the problem started to become alive. The gap could not be empty. If it were empty, nothing would move through it. Nothing would carry one state into another. Nothing would explain why sequence continues. So the gap had to be active, but it also could not be chaos. If it were chaos, the next state could be anything whatsoever. There would be no coherence, no sequence, no reason one thing follows another instead of dissolving into nonsense. So the gap had to be both open and constrained. Open because the next state had not landed yet. Constrained because not every next state was coherent. That was the phrase that started to make the most sense to me. Constrained becoming. The gap is becoming because the next mark is not fixed yet. The gap is constrained because the next mark is not arbitrary. There are relations already in motion. There are conditions already active. There's a shape to what can resolve, even before it resolves. That felt much closer. The gap was not nothing. The gap was not a static distance between two objects. The gap was the active interval where unresolved potential moved under coherence until it could land as form. That is why an almost state is not a state. A thing has either cohered or it has not. An unfinished relation is not almost complete. A contradicted desire is not almost manifestation. A field configuration that has not cohered is not a lower version of the thing. It is still unresolved. It may be moving, it may be implied, it may be close, but until it coheres, it has not become the state. That was the difference I was trying to see. Unresolved becoming versus resolved form. And the longer I stayed with that, the more I saw the trap in how I was trying to solve it. I wanted the answer to land. Of course I did. That is what the mind does with a problem. It wants the statement, the formulation, the clean conclusion, the point where it can say, there, that is it. But this question was different because the thing I was trying to understand was the movement before the there. There is already a mark. The answer, once stated, is already a mark. A number is a mark, a proof is a mark, a conclusion is a mark. So if I rushed to the conclusion, I was only creating another mark. I was not necessarily seeing the movement that made marks possible. That was the first real awakening inside the question. The question was teaching me how my own mind was trying to answer it. I was trying to stand outside the current and define it. But the current was the thing I was already inside. The gap was not sitting somewhere else, waiting for me to point at it. It was active in the very movement of the inquiry. I would reach one formulation, then feel it was not enough, then move to another, then another. Each formulation landed for a moment. Then the question opened again. At first that felt like failure, but then I started to see it differently. Each answer was a mark. Each insufficiency reopened the gap. Each movement from one formulation to the next was showing me the very thing I was asking about. The question was not only about numbers anymore. It was happening in the attempt to answer. One thought would land, then another, then another. And between them was the same unresolved movement, the same constrained becoming, the same current carrying one distinction into the next. That is when the attachment to the problem made sense. I was not attached because I wanted a famous solution. I was attached because the question seemed to be exposing the structure of inquiry itself. How something becomes clear, how a thought lands, how a possibility resolves, how the mind moves from unformed recognition into form, and why some forms, even when they are useful, still feel incomplete. Because the form is where the movement landed. It's not the whole movement. That is why the question had so much force. It made me look at the space between the numbers. Then it made me look at the space between my own thoughts. The space between one attempted answer and the next. The space where something was not yet settled, but was clearly moving. And once I saw that, the inquiry had to widen. Because numbers were only the first marks I was looking at. Thoughts were marks too. Statements were marks. Questions were marks. Words were marks. And if the same gap was active between every number, then maybe it was also active between every word. That was the next opening. The problem began as a mathematical question. But the question itself started moving. And the next place it moved was into language. Act 2, the space between the wicked lies. This is where the question moved. The space between the numbers had already shown me something. A number is a mark. A number is where movement has landed. But then a lyric appeared, the space between the wicked lies. And suddenly the same structure was no longer only mathematical. It was human. A wicked lie was not merely a false statement. It was not simply deception. A wicked lie was a form that had landed where living truth was still moving. A word, a role, a verdict, a defense, a sentence, a question, a mark. That is why this lyric fit the problem so precisely. The song was not simply saying there is a space between two people. It was showing that the space itself is where truth remains alive before it gets collapsed into the forms on either side. The wicked lies are the marks. The space between them is the movement. The lyric is the gap speaking to the mark. The phrase contains the whole structure. There is the space, then there are the lies. The space is not one of the lies, the space is between them. So the truth is not located in either collapsed form. It is not this position, it is not that position. It is not my defense, it is not your defense. It is not the thing I said, it is not the thing you said. It is the living movement between the forms both people are trying to use. That is why the word wicked matters. The lie is not wicked because form exists. Form has to exist, words have to exist, questions have to exist. A sentence has to be spoken, a hand has to be held, A shot has to leave the hand. The wickedness begins when the form is used to replace the living truth. The mark becomes the authority. The form says, I am the truth. And the space between disappears. This is the translation from the mathematical question. A number is a mark, a word is a mark, a lie is a mark, a question is a mark, a verdict is a mark. One mark lands, another mark lands, but the real truth is still moving between them. The opening lyric does not let the listener settle on one side. It keeps placing us between emotional forms, between pain and love, between what wounds and what saves, between what is said and what is actually alive underneath it. The lyric is not trying to define the truth as one side of the pair. It keeps the listener in the interval. That interval is the space between the numbers, now appearing as the space between emotional marks. This is where love starts to become visible. Because love is not the mark. Love is not the role. Love is not the demand. Love is not the sentence someone needs to hear in order to feel safe. Love is the living relation moving between forms. So when love gets forced into a mark, the mark becomes too small. The person says, say what this is. Tell me where I stand. Tell me what you mean. Tell me who is wrong. Tell me who is right. Tell me whether I am safe. Tell me whether this is real. And all of that is understandable. But underneath it, love is being forced to land before it has been allowed to move. That is the wicked lie, love forced into a mark inside form. This is where samadhi first became visible to me. Not as a mystical concept, as the ability to remain in the space. In Act 1, the question was, can I remain with the space between numbers without forcing it into another number? Here, the question became, can I remain with the space between people without forcing love into a verdict? That is harder, because numbers do not threaten the heart. People do, love does, uncertainty does. The unresolved relational field is where the mind most wants collapse. So the lyric is showing the exact pressure point. The space between the wicked lies is where love remains alive before fear forces it into form. Then the song shows the mechanism. Words begin to fail, not because words are bad. The song itself is words. The phrase that opened the whole thing came through words. So the problem cannot be language itself. The problem is what happens when words stop pointing back to the living space. That is what the repeated talking means. Language starts circling itself. Speech produces more speech. Explanation produces more explanation. Clarification produces more confusion. The living relation is moving underneath, but instead of entering it, the mind keeps making marks. Another word, another defense, another interpretation, another question, another attempt to make the field land. This is the language version of the mathematical trap. In Act 1, I was trying to solve the space between numbers by making it into another number-like thing. Here, the song shows people trying to solve the space between love by making it into more words. That is why the words become unstable. Then comes the rain question. This is the cleanest example. On the surface, it sounds ordinary, a simple question, a safe question. But inside the song, the emotional weather is already happening. The storm is already in the room. Pain is already moving. Sadness is already present. Love is already under pressure. So the question is not really about weather. It is displacement. The mind is standing inside a storm and asking for a weather report. That is the whole collapse in miniature. The living truth is, something is happening between us. The collapse question is, will it rain today? The mind takes the living field and moves it into a safer object. It makes the storm external. It makes the pain discussable. It makes the truth manageable. It turns love into weather. That is a wicked lie structure. Not because the question is false. Because the question becomes a substitute for entering the reality already present. The mark replaces the movement, the word replaces the relation, the safe question replaces the living field. That is why this song fit the Yang Mills question so precisely. The mathematical question had shown me the space between numbers. The song showed me the space between wicked lies. Those were not separate discoveries. They were the same structure appearing at different levels. A number is a collapsed mark. A word is a collapsed mark. A question is a collapsed mark. A verdict is a collapsed mark. A lie, in this sense, is a collapsed mark. But love is not the mark. Love is what remains alive before the mind forces it to become representation in form. Love is the truth that outruns conceptualization itself. The space between the wicked lies is where love is still alive. And when the mind cannot remain there, when it needs love to become a sentence, a role, a guarantee, a defense, a verdict, or a proof, love is forced into representation. That forced representation is the wicked lie. Not because the form is false, not because the word is false, not because the question is false, but because the representation has been made to stand in for the living truth. That is where the next layer opened. Because if the wicked lie is truth trapped in representation, then Plato's cave was not only about shadows on a wall. It was about the human habit of trusting the representation more than the living truth it came from. Act 3, Plato's cave clarified by the space between. The Dave Matthews lyric changed how I saw Plato's cave. It showed that the space between was not only between numbers. It was between words, questions, positions, defenses. The forms people use when something living becomes too difficult to remain inside. That is why wicked lies mattered. A wicked lie was not merely a false statement. It was a representation, a mark, a form where living truth had been forced to land. And once I saw that, Plato's cave became clearer. The ordinary explanation of Plato's cave is simple. People are chained in a cave, they watch shadows on a wall. Because the shadows are all they know, they mistake the shadows for reality. One person escapes, sees the fire, leaves the cave, sees the sun, and realizes that what everyone called real was only projection. That explanation is useful. But after Dave Matthews, it was not deep enough. Because the deeper problem is not only that people mistake false images for real things. The deeper problem is that people mistake representation for reality. A shadow is representation, a word is representation, a number is representation, a question is representation, a conclusion is representation, a relationship label is representation, a theory is representation, a thought is representation. And once representation becomes more trusted than the living truth it came from, the cave is already active. This is how the cave forms. Something living moves first. A feeling, a recognition, a relation, a possibility, a truth not yet settled into form. Then the mind tries to hold it. So it becomes a word. Then the word becomes a concept. Then the concept becomes an explanation. Then the explanation becomes a position. Then the position becomes something to defend. By the end, the person is no longer in direct contact with the living thing. They are defending the representation of it. They are watching the shadow. They are inside the cave. That is why the cave is so hard to see. The representation may be useful, it may be intelligent, it may be close, it may even be factually correct, but it is still not the living thing itself. It is the shadow of something that moved before it became visible. This is what the song shows in real time. The words begin to confuse, the talking repeats, language multiplies. But the more the words multiply, the less contact there is with the living space underneath them. That is Plato's cave as human communication. Not chains, not mythology. Just two people inside a living emotional field trying to survive it by turning it into words. Something real is moving between them. But instead of remaining with that reality, the mind creates more representations. Another sentence, another explanation, another defense, another interpretation, another attempt to define what is happening. Every one of those can become another shadow on the wall. That is what the repeated talking reveals. The words meant to reach the truth can begin replacing the truth. The rain question makes the cave even clearer. Inside the song, the emotional weather is already happening. The storm is already present. The sadness is already moving, the pain is already in the room, But the mind asks about weather as if the storm is somewhere else. That is the cave. The person is inside the living truth, but the question moves the truth into representation. The storm becomes a weather report. The pain becomes something discussable. The direct field becomes an object at a distance. The living reality says, something is happening here. The mind says, let me turn it into something I can ask about. That is why the rain question is so precise. It shows how the cave can happen inside a single sentence. The question does not have to be false. It only has to become safer than contact. The representation becomes safer than the living truth. And once that happens, the cave has appeared. This is what Plato's cave becomes after Dave Matthews. The shadows are not only images. They are the forms the mind uses to avoid the space between. Right, wrong, safe, unsafe, mine, yours, love, rejection, proofser, truth. Each word can point to something real. But each word can also become a wall. The danger is not that forms exist. The danger is that the mind starts treating the form as final. The number becomes more trusted than the movement. The word becomes more trusted than the meaning. The question becomes more trusted than the field. The explanation becomes more trusted than the reality it was trying to explain. The weather report becomes more trusted than the storm. That is the cave beneath the cave. Not merely mistaking illusion for reality, mistaking representation for living truth. That is the deeper demand. Truth must become recognizable before the mind will trust it. Become a word, become a number, become a proof, become a theory, become a label, become a position, become something I can point to, become something I can explain, become something I can hold. But the moment truth becomes holdable, it has already become representation. It has already become a mark, and the mark is never the full movement. This is why even a true explanation can become a shadow. Even a correct concept can become a cave. Even Plato's cave can become another cave if the mind turns it into a final representation. That is the trap. The mind wants an image of truth, then it mistakes the image for truth. This is where Dave Matthews clarifies Plato. Plato shows the human being trapped by shadows. Dave Matthews shows how the shadows are made. They are made whenever the living space becomes too much for the mind to remain inside. So the mind speaks, explains, questions, defines, labels, defends, represents. The cave is not only a place people are trapped. The cave is an activity. It is something the mind does. It turns living movement into form, then treats the form as more real than the movement. That is why the space between matters. The space between is what the cave covers over. The space between is what disappears when representation becomes final. The space between is where truth was still moving before the shadow landed on the wall. So Act 3 clarified the trap. Act 1 showed me the space between numbers. Act 2 showed me the space between wicked lies. Act 3 showed me what happens when the forms on either side become the world. That is Plato's cave. The cave is the world of representations treated as reality. The wicked lie is one of those representations when it stands in for living truth. And the song clarifies the cave because it shows the exact mechanism. The words confuse, the talking loops, the storm becomes a weather question, the living field becomes something safer to discuss. That is the cave in motion, representation replacing contact. The next question is not how to destroy representation. Representation is how anything appears. The next question is, what is the correct relation to representation so the form can appear without becoming the cave? Act 4, Klay Thompson and the place beyond the rules. Before this becomes metaphysical, the quarter itself has to be understood. On January 23, 2015, Klay Thompson scored 37 points in the third quarter against the Sacramento Kings. Not 37 in a game, 37 in one quarter, 12 minutes. He went 13 for 13 from the field, 9 for 9 from 3, 2 for 2 from the free throw line. Every shot he took went in. It became the highest scoring quarter in NBA history. That matters because basketball is already a game of marks. A shot goes up, a shot lands, the scoreboard changes. 2 points, 3 points, another registered outcome. So at first glance, the significance is obvious. 37. That is the record. That is what history remembers. But when you actually watch the quarter, the number is not the strange part. The strange part is how it looks while it is happening. Klay does not look like someone carefully building a record. He does not look like someone calculating his way into history. He does not look like someone checking his mechanics before each release. At points, he almost looks like he is just chucking the ball at the basket. Catch, turn, release, catch, drift, release, catch, fire, release. And that is what makes the quarter relevant to this question. Because if some of those shots missed, a coach could point to them and say, your feet were not set, you rushed that, your body was drifting, that was not the correct shot. But they did not miss. So the mind does something different afterward. It calls it rhythm, it calls it heat, it calls it being unconscious, it calls it the zone, it calls it one of the greatest shooting performances ever. And all of that is true enough as description, but it still arrives after the fact. Those are marks placed onto the event after the movement already happened. The real thing is visible before the explanation. Klay is not shooting from the rules. He is shooting from the place beyond the rules. At lower levels, form has to be taught from the outside. Set your feet, square your shoulders, keep your elbow aligned, bend your knees, hold your follow-through, repeat the mechanics. That matters. You cannot skip that stage and call it mastery. A beginner with bad footwork is not beyond form. He is just beneath it. But Klay is not beneath form in that quarter. He is beyond external obedience to form. The rules have already been absorbed. The mechanics have already been metabolized. The teaching diagram has disappeared into the body. So when the shot comes, he is not consulting the representation of a correct shot. The shot is arising from the living movement that the representation was originally trying to train. That is the distinction. The rule is a mark. The shooting form is a representation. It points toward coherence, but it is not the living truth of shooting. The living truth is the movement that knows how to resolve. That is why Klay can appear to violate the visible version of the rule while still fulfilling the deeper function of the rule. His feet may not look set, his body may be drifting, the release may look rushed. But the movement is whole, the shot resolves. The form may look broken from outside the current, but from inside the current it is coherent. This is where the quarter becomes the continuation of the question. Act 1 showed me that the number is not the movement. Act 2 showed me that words, lies, and questions can also become marks. Act 3 showed me that the cave appears when representation becomes more trusted than the living truth it came from. Klay's quarter shows the opposite movement. It shows what happens when representation has been absorbed so completely that it no longer interrupts the living truth. He is not stopping to translate the moment into a concept before acting. He is not asking the representation for permission. The ball arrives, the body receives, the shot leaves, the form appears. That is why it can look reckless and perfect at the same time. From outside the movement, it can look like chucking. From inside mastery, it is not chucking, it is immediacy. It is the shot appearing before the mind can turn the shot into a problem. Watch how little space there is for self-consciousness. There is no visible negotiation with the result. No pause where he appears to ask, am I open enough? Are my feet right? Is this a good shot? Can I keep this going? What happens if I miss? That kind of thought would turn the shot into a representation before the shot could happen. It would insert the cave between perception and action. But in the quarter, the movement does not appear to stop for representation. The game moves, he moves with it, the ball finds him, the shot leaves, the next mark appears. This is not passivity, he's not doing nothing. And it is not brute force. He's not imposing himself on the game from the outside. He is participating in the current of the game from inside it. That is where the line fits, flowing with whatever moves me, like I'm swimming. Swimming is the exact image. A swimmer does not command the water. A swimmer also does not surrender into helplessness. A swimmer moves with the medium, through resistance, through pressure, through timing, through openings. The water is not conquered, it is entered. That is what Klay looks like in the quarter. He is swimming in the game. The court, the defenders, the passes, the rhythm, the clock, the crowd, the score, the body, the ball, all of it is the medium. And he is not outside it trying to force a result. He is moving with whatever moves him. Catch, rise, release, relocate, catch again, release again. The shot is not being manufactured from the outside. It is resolving from inside the current. This is why flow cannot mean there are no constraints. The shot still has to obey the basket, the ball still has to travel through space, the release still has to be coherent, the body still has to organize itself, the defender still matters, the game situation still matters. So this is not pure freedom, it is not anything goes. It is constrained becoming the same structure from the beginning. Open, because the next outcome has not landed yet. Constrained because the next outcome cannot be arbitrary. Klay is free inside the constraints because he is no longer fighting them. The rules are not gone, they have become the channel. The form is not absent, it has become transparent. The mark is still produced, but it is produced from movement, not from fear. That is the place beyond the rules. Not where rules stop mattering, where rules no longer need to appear as rules. They have been absorbed so deeply that the body can move from the thing the rules were always pointing toward. That is mastery. Mastery is not merely perfect obedience to form. Perfect obedience is still conscious of the form. Mastery is when form has been so fully integrated that it can disappear as an external command. Then the movement becomes immediate. That is why the quarter looks impossible. The shots do not look like a man obeying a diagram. They look like a man expressing from a place where the diagram has already done its job. The diagram trained the body, then the body no longer needed the diagram. That is the same thing Plato's cave prepared us to see. The shooting form is not the truth, it is a representation of the truth. A useful representation, a necessary representation at one stage. But if the player never moves beyond the representation, he remains mechanical. He may be correct, but he is not free. Klay is free because the representation has dissolved back into living movement. This is also why the 37-point quarter is not merely relevant because of the number. The number matters because it proves the event landed in form. It was not imaginary, it was not just a private state. The scoreboard had to register it, the game had to record it, the league had to count it. 37 became the mark. But if you only see the mark, you miss the thing the mark came from. The truth of the quarter was not 37. 37 is where the truth landed. The truth was the current moving through Klay cleanly enough that the number became possible. Every made basket was a number appearing out of movement. The shot released, the ball traveled, the net received it, the score changed. Movement became mark, movement became number, movement became visible. And in that quarter it happened so cleanly, so repeatedly, so impossibly, that the distinction became obvious. The number is downstream, the movement is upstream. The scoreboard records the shadow, the body expresses the truth. This is the first time the inquiry shows its positive side. Before this, the gap appeared as a problem. A gap between numbers, a gap between words, a gap covered over by representation, a cave. But here the gap is alive. It is the space where the next shot has not yet become a shot, but the movement is already forming. The ball is on its way, the body is turning, the defense is shifting, the pass is arriving, the outcome is not fixed, but it is not random. Everything is moving toward resolution. And Klay is inside that movement. He is not forcing the shot to become a mark. He is allowing the mark to appear because the movement is coherent. That is why the made basket is different from a wicked lie. A wicked lie is form forced to replace living truth. A made basket in that quarter is form expressing living truth. The shot lands, the number appears, the crowd erupts, the scoreboard changes. But the form does not imprison the movement. It reveals that the movement was clean. So the 37-point quarter matters for two reasons. First, because historically, it is one of the clearest statistical eruptions the game has ever recorded. 37 points in a quarter, 13 made shots without a miss, 9 threes without a miss, a perfect 12-minute eruption. But second, and more importantly for this inquiry, because when you watch it, the record does not look like a record being constructed. It looks like truth in motion. It looks like the gap becoming visible through a body. It looks like the space between the pass and the shot and the basket and the next possession, staying open enough that nothing gets blocked by self-conscious collapse. That is what the line names, flowing with whatever moves me like I'm swimming. Not forcing the water, not worshiping the rule, not clinging to the mark, moving with the current until the form appears. That is the recognition of Act 4. The mark still matters, the number still matters, the shot still matters. But the mark is not the truth. The mark is where truth in motion became visible. Final act, the real gap. So now the question comes back to where it began. The Yang Mills gap pulled me in because it looked like a mathematical problem. A question about what separates unresolved potential from actual form. But by following it, the gap started appearing everywhere. Between numbers, between words, between wicked lies, inside Plato's cave, inside Klay Thompson's body as the shot appeared before the mind could interrupt it. And once the same structure appeared in all of those places, the question changed. It was no longer only, why is there a gap before the first real state? What moves before the mark lands? What remains true before truth becomes representation? That was the real gap I was trying to understand. Each act revealed one layer. The number showed the structure. A number is where movement has landed. The mark is visible, but the movement that produced it is deeper. The song made that structure human. The space between the wicked lies is where love is still alive before the mind forces it into a word, a verdict, a defense, a guarantee, or a role. Plato showed the trap. The cave is what happens when representation becomes more trusted than the living truth it came from. The mark becomes the world, the shadow calls itself truth. And Klay showed the opposite. Form appearing cleanly, the shot still lands, the number still appears, 37 still matters. But the number is not the event, the number is where the event landed. The truth was the movement, the current, the embodied coherence, the form appearing without being blocked by representation. So the gap, the space between love, samadhi, and truth in motion are not the same word. They are different representations, but they point toward the same living structure. The gap names it structurally. The space between names it experientially. Love names it relationally. Samadhi names the state capable of remaining there. Truth in motion names what it is before it becomes form. That is why the answer could not simply be another final concept. A final concept would only be another mark, another shadow, another cave, another possible wicked lie if it pretended to contain the whole truth. The thing I was trying to understand was the movement before understanding becomes a thing. So the answer had to be approached from inside the movement. This is the difference between forced collapse and clean expression. Forced collapse happens when the mind cannot remain in the gap. It needs the mark too soon. The sentence, the proof, the label, the guarantee, the finality. So it grabs the living truth and forces it into representation. That is blockage, that is the wicked lie, that is the cave. Clean expression is different. Clean expression allows form to appear from the movement without severing from it. The word is spoken, but it remains open. The number appears, but it remains a mark. The shot lands, but it remains the trace of movement. The hand is taken, but the person is not possessed. The answer is given, but the answer does not claim to exhaust truth. That is beauty. Forced collapse produces blockage. Clean expression produces beauty. The issue was never form versus no form. The issue was whether form remains connected to the truth moving through it. That brings the Yang Mills question back into focus. The answer I found was not a formal proof. It was not the official solution to the Klay problem. That distinction matters. But the metaphysical recognition was real. The gap is the living interval where potential is not yet form, but is already moving under coherence. It is the place before the mark, before the number, before the word, before the shot, before love becomes possession, before truth becomes representation. And the mistake is trying to solve it by destroying it. Trying to collapse the space between so completely that nothing remains unresolved. But the unresolved is not the enemy. The unresolved is where truth is alive before expression. The point is not to eliminate the gap, the point is to enter it correctly. To stay coherent inside it. To stop forcing truth into representation just because the mind wants safety. To let form emerge when the movement is ready. That is what the line names, flowing with whatever moves me like I'm swimming. The swimmer does not possess the water, the shooter does not possess the shot, the lover does not possess love, the thinker does not possess truth. They participate, they move with the current, and when the movement is clean, form appears. A number, a word, a shot, a song, a hand, an answer. But the form stays open. It does not become the cave, it does not become the wicked lie, it becomes a doorway. So the real gap was never just a missing proof. It was the space between potential and expression. The space between movement and mark. The space between truth and representation. The space between love and possession. The space between the living thing and the form it becomes. And the final answer is not to stand outside that space and define it once and for all. That would only create another mark. The final answer is to inhabit it so cleanly that the mark can appear without becoming false. That is samadhi, that is love, that is the space between, that is truth in motion. And that is the real gap I was trying to solve.